meet someone who seems perfect. She's intelligent, attractive, genuinely interested in your niche knowledge about vintage synthesizers or Byzantine history or whatever it is that lights up your brain. The first few dates feel like magic because she actually listens when you explain things. She doesn't roll her eyes when you get detailed. She seems fascinated by the way your mind works. 3 months later, she's frustrated that you forgot her birthday even though she mentioned it twice. 6 months in, she's hurt that you didn't notice her new haircut. A year down the line, she's exhausted from what she calls your emotional unavailability, and you're confused because you've been more open with her than anyone in your life. Then it ends, and you're left wondering what the hell happened because from your perspective, you were being exactly the person she said she wanted. Here's the truth nobody wants to say out loud. Women don't sabotage neurodivergent men in dating because they're cruel or manipulative. They sabotage neurodivergent men because they're operating from a completely different neurological playbook, and neither person realizes there are two different games being played on the same field until someone's already losing. Let me paint you a specific picture. You're 32 years old, finally got the courage to try dating apps after years of failed attempts at bars and social events that felt like sensory torture chambers. You match with someone who says in her profile that she values deep conversation and authenticity. Your first message is a carefully crafted paragraph about something she mentioned loving, let's say true crime documentaries, and you share 3 specific observations about criminal psychology that you've been researching. She responds enthusiastically. You think you've found someone who appreciates the way you communicate. Fast forward 2 months. You're having dinner, and she makes a comment about her coworker that seems like she's just sharing information. You take it at face value, offer a logical solution to the workplace problem she described, and continue eating. Her energy shifts. The rest of dinner feels cold. In the car, she's quiet. When you ask what's wrong, she says nothing, but her tone says everything. You spend the next 3 days replaying the conversation in your mind, searching for what you missed, finding nothing. Here's what happened. She wasn't sharing information. She was doing something that neurotypical communication is absolutely saturated with, something that your brain is fundamentally not wired to automatically decode. She was engaging in what relationship researchers call bidding for emotional connection. She wasn't presenting a problem for you to solve. She was creating an opportunity for you to demonstrate empathy, to align with her emotional experience, to validate her feelings about a frustrating situation. Your logical solution, which was genuinely meant to be helpful, registered to her nervous system as dismissal, as you not caring enough to connect with her emotionally, as you being unable or unwilling to meet her where she was. The really painful part is that you were trying to help. You heard someone you care about describe a problem, and your brain immediately started working on the most efficient path to resolution, because that's what your neurology does brilliantly. You were demonstrating care in the language your brain speaks. She was asking for care in the language her brain speaks. Neither language was wrong. But only one person got blamed when the translation failed. This pattern repeats itself in countless variations throughout relationships with neurodivergent men. She mentions she's tired after work. You suggest she go to bed earlier or look into vitamin supplements. She wanted you to say you understand how exhausting her day must have been. She tells you about a conflict with her sister. You point out the logical inconsistencies in her sister's position. She wanted you to acknowledge how hurt she must feel. She says she feels like you don't prioritize her. You list the specific things you've done for her that week. She wanted you to understand the emotional experience underneath her words, not a defense of your actions. Every single one of these moments, you're operating from a place of genuine care and attempting to be helpful. Every single one of these moments, she experiences it as rejection. And here's where the sabotage begins, except it's not conscious or intentional. It's just what happens when someone's needs aren't being met and they don't understand why. She starts testing you, not because she's playing games, but because she's trying to figure out if you actually care about her or if you're just going through the motions. She stops explicitly stating what she needs and starts expecting you to pick up on subtle cues. Because in her worldview, if you really cared, you'd notice. You really care, but you don't notice. Because your brain doesn't naturally track the micro-expressions, tone shifts, and contextual hints that her brain both broadcasts and receives automatically. So you fail tests you didn't know you were taking. She interprets this as proof that you're not invested enough. She escalates the testing. Mentions plans more vaguely to see if you'll remember and follow up. Drops hints about things she wants instead of directly stating them. Pulls back slightly on affection to see if you'll notice and pursue. Each test you fail confirms her growing belief that something is fundamentally wrong, either with you, with her, or with the relationship. Meanwhile, you're noticing that something has changed, but you can't identify what. And when you ask directly, she says everything is fine, but her entire demeanor communicates that nothing is fine. You're stuck in an impossible situation. You can't solve a problem you can't see, and she can't explain a problem that she believes should be obvious. This resonates with what you've experienced. Hit that like button, because we're about to go deeper into why this pattern is so devastating and why it keeps happening even when both people have good intentions. The sabotage intensifies through what I call the interpretation spiral. She starts reinterpreting your past behavior through the lens of her current frustration. That time you stayed up until 3 a.m. helping her format her resume, which was a genuine expression of care through action, gets reframed as you being more comfortable with tasks than emotions. That weekend you researched everything about her favorite author so you could discuss the themes she loved, which was you showing love through learning about her interests, gets reframed as you needing to intellectualize everything instead of just feeling. Your consistency, which is actually one of your strengths, gets reframed as you being predictable and not putting an effort anymore. She's not doing this maliciously. Her brain is trying to make sense of an emotional experience, the experience of feeling disconnected from someone who seems to care, but in ways that don't register as caring to her nervous system. So her brain creates a story that explains the disconnect, and that story usually centers on you being deficient in some way. Not romantic enough, not emotionally available enough, not attentive enough, not present enough. Here's the really insidious part. She starts trying to fix you. Again, not from cruelty, but from a genuine belief that if you just learn to be more emotionally expressive, more spontaneous, more attentive to unspoken needs, the relationship would work. She sends you articles about emotional intelligence. She suggests couples therapy, which isn't wrong in itself, but the framing is that you need to learn how to communicate properly, with the implication that your way of communicating is the problem. She compares you to her friends' boyfriends who remember to bring flowers without being asked, who notice when she's upset before she says anything, who plan elaborate surprises. Each comparison is a small cut, not because you're inadequate, but because you're being measured against neurotypical standards that your brain literally processes differently. You want to meet her needs. You're trying so hard that you're exhausting yourself. But you're trying to hit a moving target that nobody has clearly defined for you. And every time you think you understand what's expected, the expectations seem to shift. Let's talk about what happens to you during this process. Because the sabotage isn't just about what she does, it's about what this dynamic does to your sense of self. You start masking harder. If she needs you to be more emotionally expressive, you start forcing yourself to perform emotions in ways that feel unnatural. You study her reactions like you're trying to crack a code, because in a sense, you are. You set 17 reminders for important dates and events, not because you don't care, but because you've learned that your natural memory prioritization doesn't align with relationship expectations. You start second-guessing every response before you give it, running it through a filter of how she might interpret it, rather than just responding authentically. You become hypervigilant to her moods, which is exhausting because you're manually processing information that neurotypical brains process automatically. The relationship that started as a place where you felt accepted becomes another environment where you have to perform a version of yourself that isn't natural. The irony is brutal. She was initially attracted to your authenticity, to the way you didn't play social games, to your directness, and your passion for your interests. But as the relationship progresses, she inadvertently punishes those exact qualities because they don't come packaged with the neurotypical social-emotional skills she expects alongside them. You're not imagining this, and you're not broken. What's happening is a fundamental mismatch in neurological communication styles, but our entire cultural narrative about relationships is built on neurotypical assumptions. Every romantic comedy, every relationship advice column, every couples counselor who doesn't understand neurodivergence is reinforcing the idea that there's one right way to show love, one right way to communicate care, one right way to be a good partner. And that one right way just happens to align with neurotypical social processing. When you don't naturally perform according to that script, it gets labeled as a deficit. You're not thoughtful enough. You're not emotionally intelligent enough. You're not trying hard enough. Never mind that you're thinking constantly about her well-being, that you're processing emotions intensely, even if you don't display them conventionally, that you're trying so hard you're burning yourself out. The metric for success is based on neurotypical expression, so your different form of expression doesn't count. Here's where it gets even more complicated. Some women, usually after the relationship has ended, or after significant conflict, start researching why the relationship felt so difficult. They discover information about neurodivergence, and suddenly everything clicks into a different pattern. Sometimes this leads to understanding and repair. More often, it leads to a different kind of sabotage. They start viewing everything you do through the lens of your neurodivergence, but not in a neutral or accepting way. Your need for routine becomes you being inflexible. Your sensory sensitivities become you being difficult. Your direct communication becomes you being harsh. Your special interests become you being obsessive. Every trait gets pathologized. You're no longer a person who has different neurological wiring that comes with both strengths and challenges. You become a collection of symptoms that she has to manage or cope with. She might even frame it as her being compassionate and understanding, but the underlying message is clear. You are fundamentally more difficult to love than a neurotypical partner would be, and she deserves credit for tolerating your differences. This is particularly damaging because it often comes wrapped in the language of acceptance. She says she understands that you're neurodivergent, that she knows you can't help certain things, that she's learned to adjust her expectations. But understanding that frames you as less than doesn't feel like acceptance. It feels like resignation, like she's staying with a compromised version of what she really wanted. You can sense it in the way she explains your behavior to her friends. You can hear it in the patient tone she uses when you've missed another social cue. You can feel it in the exhausted sigh when you need to leave a social event early due to sensory overload. The relationship becomes characterized by her accommodation of your differences, rather than mutual appreciation of different strengths. Subscribe if you want more truth about what actually happens in relationships when neurotypes collide, because I'm not here to sugarcoat the complicated reality of these dynamics. Let's address what happens when you try to explain your experience. You finally gather the courage to say that you feel like you're constantly failing at standards you don't fully understand, that you're trying as hard as you can but it never seems like enough, that you show love differently but it still counts as love. You're hoping for understanding, for dialogue, for some mutual acknowledgement that you're both speaking different languages and maybe you can learn each other's languages together. What often happens instead is that your attempt to explain your experience gets interpreted as making excuses. She hears your explanation of neurological differences as you refusing to take responsibility. She hears your description of trying hard as you claiming you shouldn't have to try harder. She hears your request for direct communication as you demanding she manage your limitations. The conversation you hoped would create understanding instead becomes another piece of evidence that you don't get it, that you're not willing to do the real work of the relationship. Here's the mechanism behind why this conversation goes wrong. In neurotypical relationship frameworks, there's a strong cultural narrative that says, if you really love someone, You'll change for them. You'll grow and adapt and become a better version of yourself through the relationship. This narrative isn't entirely wrong. Growth is important, but it's built on the assumption that the change required is within your capacity, that it's about choosing to prioritize differently or develop skills that are latent but underdeveloped. For neurodivergent men, some of what's being asked isn't about choosing to prioritize or developing latent skills. It's about fundamental differences in neurological processing. You can learn strategies. You can develop workarounds. You can absolutely grow and improve, but you cannot rewire your basic neurology to automatically process social-emotional information the way a neurotypical brain does. Asking you to just naturally notice subtle emotional cues is like asking a colorblind person to just try harder to see red. The apparatus for processing that information in the expected way isn't there. When you try to explain this, it sounds like you're saying you can't change, which in the neurotypical relationship framework sounds like you're saying you won't change, which sounds like you don't love her enough to try. The relationship reaches a point where you're damned either way. If you explain your neurological differences, you're making excuses. If you don't explain them, you're being willfully inconsiderate. If you ask for direct communication about needs, you're being demanding. If you try to guess what she needs, you're going to guess wrong and prove you don't understand her. If you show love through actions, you're avoiding real intimacy. If you try to express emotions in more conventional ways, it feels performative, and she can sense the inauthenticity. You cannot win, not because you're inadequate, but because the game is designed for a different kind of player. Let me tell you what this does over time. It creates a deep-seated belief that you are fundamentally unlovable in your natural state, that the real you, the you that thinks in systems and patterns, that processes information intensely, that feels emotions deeply but expresses them differently, that needs structure and routine, that gets absorbed in interests, that communicates directly, that experiences the world through different sensory filters. That version of you is too much work, too difficult, too different. The only way you could be lovable is if you successfully pretend to be someone you're not. And even then, the effort of pretending will eventually exhaust you, and the mask will slip, and you'll be back to being too much and not enough simultaneously. This belief doesn't just affect the current relationship. It affects every future relationship. It affects how you show up in the world. It affects your willingness to be vulnerable. It creates a deep loneliness that comes from hiding your authentic self, because you've learned that your authentic self leads to disappointment and rejection. Now let's talk about the women's experience in this, because understanding her perspective doesn't mean you're wrong, and it doesn't mean she's wrong either. It means you're two people with fundamentally different neurological operating systems trying to build something together without a shared manual. From her perspective, she entered the relationship with certain expectations about emotional reciprocity, about intuitive understanding developing over time, about growing closer through unspoken connection. These aren't unreasonable expectations in a neurotypical relationship framework. They're actually how many successful relationships between neurotypical people function. The problem is, they're based on both people having similar neurological infrastructure for processing social-emotional information. She's experiencing genuine pain. When you offer a solution instead of empathy, her brain interprets that as disconnection, and the feeling of disconnection in a romantic relationship triggers actual distress in her nervous system. When you don't notice her new haircut or her subtle mood shift, it doesn't just feel like an oversight. It feels like evidence that you're not paying attention to her, that she's not important enough for you to notice, that you're not as invested as she is. These feelings are real, even though the interpretation of what caused them is inaccurate. She's also getting messages from her social circle that reinforce her interpretation. Her friends listen to her describe the relationship and see red flags everywhere. He doesn't notice when you're upset. He doesn't remember things you've told him. He doesn't plan romantic gestures. He seems more interested in his hobbies than in you. Her friends, operating from neurotypical frameworks, confirm that these are signs of a partner who isn't sufficiently invested. They encourage her to demand more, to expect better, to not settle for someone who doesn't meet her needs. They're not wrong that her needs aren't being met, but they're wrong about why, and they're wrong about the solution. The solution they're pushing, which is essentially for you to become more neurotypical in your expressions of care, isn't possible. But she doesn't know that, so she keeps pushing for something you cannot provide in the way she's asking for it. Here's where the tragedy deepens. You probably are showing her tremendous love, just in ways that don't translate to her system. You research her interests so you can engage with what matters to her. You maintain the stability and consistency that creates a secure base. You solve practical problems that make her life easier. You share your inner world with her in ways you don't with anyone else. You're loyal and committed and thinking about her constantly. But none of that is landing as love to her, because her system is calibrated to receive love through different signals. Emotional mirroring, spontaneous romantic gestures, remembering small details she mentioned in passing, picking up on her needs before she states them, prioritizing social connection even when it's uncomfortable. These are the signals that register as love in her neurology. It's not that one way is right and one is wrong. It's that you're both broadcasting on frequencies the other person's receiver isn't tuned to. The relationship starts breaking down in predictable stages. First, there's confusion. Something feels off, but neither person can quite articulate what. Then there's effort. Both people try harder, but they're trying in different directions, so the effort doesn't bring them closer. Then there's frustration. The trying isn't working and both people are exhausted. Then there's blame. She decides you're not capable of meeting her needs. You decide you're fundamentally flawed. Or she decides she's asking for too much. You decide she's unreasonably demanding. Either way, someone is wrong, someone is failing, someone is at fault. Then there's distance. Emotional withdrawal as a form of self-protection. Then there's the end. Sometimes explosive, more often a slow fade into resentment and disconnection. Drop a comment if you've watched this exact pattern destroy a relationship where you genuinely loved someone and they genuinely loved you. But love wasn't enough, because the translation kept failing. What makes this particularly painful is that with understanding and adjustment on both sides, many of these relationships could work. If she understood that your neurology processes and expresses emotion differently, but not less deeply, she could learn to recognize your language of love. If you understood what signals her neurology needs to feel loved and connected, you could learn to provide some of those signals in ways that don't require you to betray your authentic self. If there was mutual acknowledgement that different doesn't mean deficient, that both communication styles have validity, that the goal is building a bridge between two different systems rather than one person conforming entirely to the other's system, these relationships could not only survive, but thrive. The different perspectives and processing styles could become complementary strengths rather than sources of conflict. But that requires both people to step outside the dominant cultural narrative about relationships. It requires her to question the assumption that neurotypical emotional expression is the only valid form. It requires you to learn some translation skills without abandoning your authentic self. It requires both of you to get comfortable with a relationship that looks different from the model you've been taught. Most people can't do this, not because they're bad people, but because it's genuinely difficult to operate outside cultural scripts, especially when you're in emotional distress, and those scripts promise relief if you just follow them correctly. So instead, the relationship ends, and you both walk away with wounds. She walks away believing she wasted time on someone who couldn't truly connect with her. You walk away believing you're fundamentally broken at the relationship thing. Both of you are wrong, but both of you will carry those beliefs into your next relationships, making the same patterns more likely to repeat. Let's talk about what you're actually up against in terms of societal framing. Every movie, every TV show, every song about relationships reinforces neurotypical relationship dynamics. The guy who notices the girl is upset from across a crowded room and just knows what's wrong. The spontaneous romantic gesture that demonstrates he's been paying attention to unspoken desires. The emotional conversation where both people intuitively understand the subtext of what's being said. The gradual building of unspoken understanding where words become less necessary because the connection is so deep. These narratives are presented as universal human experiences, as what real love looks like. If your relationship doesn't match these patterns, the cultural message is clear. Something is wrong. Usually, what's wrong gets located in the person who deviates from the script, the person who doesn't pick up on unspoken cues, the person who needs direct communication, the person who shows love through actions rather than words or through consistency rather than surprises. That person becomes the problem, the one who needs to change, the one who's failing at relationships. Even therapy, which should be a place for understanding, often reinforces these patterns when the therapist doesn't understand neurodivergence. You go to couples counseling hoping for help. The therapist teaches active listening skills, which is fine. But then the therapist also emphasizes reading between the lines, picking up on nonverbal cues, building intuitive understanding, all skills that require neurological infrastructure you don't have in the same way. When you struggle with these skills despite genuine effort, the therapist's disappointment mirrors her disappointment. You're not doing the work. You're being resistant. You're not truly committed to change. The therapy becomes another place where your neurology is pathologized and you're made responsible for fixing something that isn't actually broken, just different. Here's what nobody wants to acknowledge. The sabotage isn't just her misunderstanding you. It's the entire relationship structure being built on neurotypical assumptions. It's the culture giving her permission to interpret your differences as deficits. It's the lack of alternative models for what successful relationships can look like when neurotypes differ. It's the absence of language to describe what's actually happening. When you don't have words for the real dynamic, you fill in the gap with the available narratives. And the available narratives say that if emotional connection feels hard, someone isn't trying hard enough or someone isn't capable enough. Since you're the one whose behavior doesn't match the cultural script, you become the someone who isn't capable enough. The really dark part is how this dynamic interacts with masculine expectations. You're already dealing with societal messages that men should be strong, stoic providers, problem solvers. Your neurodivergence might actually make you excellent at some of these things. You can focus intensely on providing and solving problems. But then you're also told that modern masculinity requires emotional availability, intuitive empathy, sophisticated social awareness. You're supposed to be strong but vulnerable, stoic but emotionally expressive. A problem solver who knows when not to solve problems, independent but deeply connected. These are contradictory expectations even for neurotypical men. For neurodivergent men, some of these expectations require performing skills that go against your neurological grain. You end up failing at both traditional and modern masculine ideals. Not traditionally masculine enough because you might struggle with some aspects of social dominance or reading room dynamics. Not modern masculine enough because you don't process and express emotions in expected ways. You're in a narrow space where both versions of masculinity tell you you're doing it wrong. This compounds the relationship struggles because she's also been socialized with expectations about what partners should provide. She expects you to be strong and capable, which you might be, but she also expects emotional attunement and social fluency, which are genuinely harder for you. When you can't meet both sets of expectations, it confirms for her that something is missing. She might even feel bait and switched. You seemed so confident and capable at first, so together, so interesting. Now she's discovering all these areas where you struggle, and it doesn't match the image you initially presented. What she doesn't realize is that the confident, capable version was you in your element, talking about your interests, operating in structured environments. The struggling version is you trying to navigate unstructured social emotional demands that require skills you have to manually process. Both versions are authentically you, but she experiences it as inconsistency, maybe even deception. Let me paint you another specific scenario to illustrate how this plays out in daily life. You've been together for 8 months. She suggests you go to her friend's birthday party. You agree because you want to make her happy and you're trying to be a good partner. The party is at a loud bar with crowds of people you don't know. You go, you try to engage, but within an hour you're completely overwhelmed. The sensory input is too much. The small talk with strangers is draining. You can feel yourself starting to shut down. You tell her you need to leave. She gets upset. This is important to her. You're being unsociable. You're making her look bad. Can't you just push through for one night? You try to explain that it's not about not wanting to be there for her. It's about genuine sensory and social overload. She hears excuses. She hears that her needs don't matter enough. She hears that you can't handle normal social situations. The night ends in conflict. She feels unsupported. You feel misunderstood and guilty. This exact scenario plays out over and over in different contexts. Family dinners that go too long. Social obligations that weren't planned in advance. Changes to weekend plans that throw off your equilibrium. Work events where you're expected to network. Each situation you're trying to manage genuine neurological overwhelm, while she's interpreting your struggle as lack of effort or care. The truth is that relationships with neurodivergent men require a fundamentally different framework, but almost nobody is taught that framework. They require explicit communication instead of expecting intuitive understanding. They require recognizing that different expressions of love are still love. They require accommodation of genuine neurological differences without framing those differences as problems to overcome. They require both partners to learn each other's languages, rather than one partner translating everything into the dominant language. They require letting go of the cultural script about what relationships should look like, and building something that works for the specific people involved. Most women aren't prepared for this, not because they're bad partners, but because they've been socialized into the same neurotypical relationship framework as everyone else. They genuinely don't know that there's another way to do this. So the sabotage continues, relationship after relationship. You meet someone new. There's initial excitement. Then the same patterns emerge. You try harder this time, having learned from past failures, but you're trying to fix the wrong things because nobody ever told you the real issue. You get better at setting reminders, at forcing eye contact, at performing emotional expressions, at enduring social situations that overwhelm you. You get better at masking. But masking isn't the solution. Masking is what burns you out and makes you lose yourself. The relationship might last longer because you're better at hiding your authentic self, but it doesn't feel better. It feels like slowly disappearing while someone loves a performance of you rather than the actual you. Eventually, the mask cracks. Your authentic needs and traits emerge. She's disappointed. The pattern repeats. You end up more convinced that you're the problem, more committed to masking harder next time, more lost about who you actually are underneath all the compensation strategies. What you need to understand is that you're not broken. The framework is broken. You're trying to build a house using blueprints designed for completely different materials. The blueprints aren't wrong for the materials they were designed for, but they're absolutely wrong for your materials. Your materials can build something beautiful and strong, but it will look different than the blueprint, and that's okay. The tragedy is that you keep trying to force your materials to match the blueprint, breaking yourself in the process, when what you actually need is a different blueprint that works with your actual properties. Some women can learn to work with different blueprints. They can step outside the cultural programming and recognize that different neurological wiring creates different but equally valid ways of connecting. These women are rare, not because most women are inflexible, but because it requires conscious effort to unlearn deeply ingrained assumptions about how relationships work. It requires her to question her own interpretations and feelings, to consider that when she feels disconnected, it might not mean you're not connecting, just that you're connecting in a language she hasn't learned to recognize yet. The women who can do this often have some combination of intellectual curiosity about human differences, personal experience with being outside norms in some way, exposure to neurodivergence in other relationships, or just a fundamental flexibility in how they approach problems. They're able to see that when something isn't working, the solution might not be for you to change into someone you're not, but for both of you to create a new system together. These relationships can be deeply fulfilling for both partners because they're based on actual mutual understanding, rather than one person performing a role. But finding these women and building these relationships requires you to stop accepting the narrative that you're deficient. It requires you to understand your own neurology well enough to explain it clearly. It requires you to distinguish between areas where you can develop skills and areas where you need accommodation. It requires you to be willing to walk away from relationships where you're constantly being told your authentic self isn't good enough. This is where we get to the hard truth that might be difficult to hear. Many of the relationships you've been in were never going to work, not because you failed, but because the fundamental incompatibility between neurotypes wasn't acknowledged or addressed. You could have tried harder. You could have been more perfect at masking. It still wouldn't have worked because the issue wasn't your level of effort. The issue was two incompatible operating systems trying to merge without either person understanding what was happening at that fundamental level. Accepting this doesn't mean giving up on relationships. It means being more selective about who you build relationships with. It means being upfront about your neurology earlier in the process. It means watching for how potential partners respond to differences. Do they try to change you, or do they try to understand you? Do they frame your needs as problems or as information? Do they compare you to neurotypical standards or appreciate you for who you are? These responses tell you whether someone has the capacity to love your authentic self, or whether they'll end up inadvertently sabotaging you through their inability to step outside neurotypical frameworks. The sabotage will keep happening as long as both people are operating from incompatible frameworks without awareness. She'll keep interpreting your neurological differences as personal failings. You'll keep trying to meet standards that don't account for how your brain actually works. Both of you will be in pain. Both of you will feel like you're failing. The relationship will become a source of damage rather than support. And when it ends, you'll both carry wounds that make future relationships harder. The cycle continues until someone breaks it by insisting on a different framework. Usually that someone has to be you, because you're the one who has the most to lose by continuing to accept frameworks that pathologize your neurology. Breaking the cycle means education. Understanding your own neurological profile well enough to explain it. Learning about neurotypical communication patterns not to become neurotypical, but to understand what's being asked of you, and decide what you can reasonably provide and where you need to ask for accommodation instead. It means communication, being explicit about your needs and differences from the start, rather than hoping someone will just accept you. It means boundaries. Being willing to walk away from situations where you're being asked to be someone you're not. It means selectivity, recognizing that not everyone can be a good partner for you, and that's okay. It means self-compassion, stopping the internal narrative that you're broken and replacing it with understanding that you're different, and different requires different approaches. Most importantly, it means refusing to accept relationships where love is conditional on your ability to perform neurotypicality. Real love, the kind that actually sustains over time, has to include acceptance of your actual neurology, not just tolerance of it, but genuine appreciation for the different perspectives and strengths that come with it. This kind of love is possible. It exists. But you won't find it while you're busy trying to convince someone that you're worth loving despite your differences. You'll find it when you're secure enough in yourself that you only pursue connections with people who see your differences as part of what makes you valuable, not as obstacles to overcome. The sabotage stops when you stop participating in frameworks that set you up to fail. When you stop accepting interpretations of your behavior that frame you as deficient. When you stop trying to translate everything you are into neurotypical expression. When you start insisting that relationships meet you where you are, not just demanding that you meet them where they are. This isn't about refusing to grow or adapt. It's about distinguishing between growth that expands who you are and contortion that requires you to betray fundamental aspects of your neurology. One creates stronger relationships, the other creates breakdown and resentment. You've probably been doing the contortion version, bending yourself into smaller and smaller shapes, trying to fit into frameworks that were never designed for you. It's time to stop. Not because relationships aren't worth effort, but because the effort needs to be directed toward building something new, rather than forcing yourself into something old that doesn't fit. The women who accidentally sabotage you aren't villains. They're people operating from the only framework they know, trying their best within that framework, and genuinely confused and hurt when it doesn't work. Understanding this doesn't mean accepting the sabotage. It means recognizing that the issue is bigger than any individual relationship. It's a systemic problem of neurotypical relationship models being treated as universal, when they're actually specific to neurotypical neurology. Until that changes on a cultural level, you have to protect yourself on an individual level by choosing differently, communicating differently, and accepting only relationships that work with your actual neurology rather than against it. This is the path forward, and it starts with you refusing to keep playing a game where the rules guarantee you'll lose. O Claude pode cometer erros. Confira sempre as respostas.